All right, you guys. So we are going to be talking about the distribution of data, which is a big part of summarizing the data for line plots. And so this is the same graph that you've had on your paper this whole time, but I would encourage you to redraw it. We're in box number 4 on page 1. So we're on page 1 of our notes, and we're going to box number 4 right next to total. So there's a few words that we want to define, okay? And so that's the first thing we're going to do is give some definitions, and then I'll show you an example, all right? So the first one that we're going to talk about is clusters. So you're going to write that somewhere on your paper, I don't care where. Clusters. And when we're talking about clusters, we're just talking about groups of data. So things that are clustered together are groups of data, right? And I will show you a few clusters right now. Here is one cluster that I'm going to put a box around. It's kind of grouped together. And here is another cluster of data that is grouped together. We could include that last one. It's kind of on its own, but not too far off. So those are two clusters, right? Those are groups of data. So we're going to put cluster, or you can just put C for cluster, and I'll put it here too, clusters. So in this example, we have two clusters for this example, okay? Sometimes you have no clusters, sometimes you have very many clusters. The second thing we're going to talk about are outliers. Outliers. Make sure you have the title and everything written on your paper, so at any time if you need to pause, please feel free. Those outliers are usually, those are the points that are at the end all by themselves, okay? Points at the end or beginning of the line plot. But the most important part is they are all by themselves. And in this case, really, what an outlier would really look like. So we're just going to pretend, and we're going to add one here. It was if maybe you extended this and you said 7, 8, and then your outlier was way over here, right? That would be an outlier, something like that. So go ahead and make sure that you add the 7 and the 8. This would be an outlier because it's all by itself. Okay, so it would be an outlier because it's all by itself. And it's at the end. Whereas this one right here, you can kind of add it in with this cluster if you want next to it. Okay, so the outliers are those points at the end or beginning of the line plot that are all by themselves. That's the most important piece, is that they're all by themselves. Okay, so those are outliers. Those are just those odd men out. And then the last one is gaps. And so we are going to talk about gaps. So for our outliers, let's go ahead and say today we just have one outlier. And then the last one we're going to work on today is gaps. So our gaps, let's use black for now. Yeah, so a gap, gaps are just spaces, empty spaces. Okay, I'm going to make it that simple, empty spaces. So now let's highlight some of those. So I have a gap here. In fact, that's just about the only gap. I have a small gap between 6 and 8. So in this case, we're going to say we have two gaps. There's a gap. Oops. Let me use a pen. There's a gap there and a gap there. So those are gaps. Okay? And that's my outlier. So these gaps, in this case, I have two gaps. And in some cases, you'll have 0 gaps. In some cases, you'll have 4 gaps. It depends. The same, you won't always have a cluster. You won't always have an outlier. You won't always have gaps. But those are things to look for. So those are our 3 vocabulary words that you need to be familiar with: clusters, outliers, and gaps. Now let's talk about one more piece of information, and that's actually the title of this, which is the distribution of data, right? Distribution of data. And usually when we talk about distribution of data, what we're talking about is just how it is spread out, okay? So how the data points are spread out. And sometimes you have a good little spread where you might have an example, like you would say they might be widespread because they're all over from the beginning to the end of the line plot. You might say they are clusters, so they're in little groups, right? Or typically you wouldn't say there's no spread, but you could say very little spread. So usually you'll see widespread where it's kind of all over the place. Basically the whole thing has some dots, the whole line plot, where the other ones are clusters, where it would just be in little sections. Something that looks widespread would look like this, where you have them all over the place. You know, you might have more or less, but you have them all over the place, where clusters would look something like this, where you might have some here, and then maybe some here. Those would be clusters. You'd have a cluster here and a cluster here. So that's the difference between the distribution of data.